Hey everybody, Bob Asada, Easy Credit Motors. Some quick notes on this job on this E70 BMW X5. I've got the xDrive 2009 3.0, and it's for pressing the hub and the bearing together and then mounting it onto the axle of the vehicle. Just some notes. This job did not go as smoothly as I thought it would. I've done this on a Mercedes before. Both axles that went through pretty smoothly, relatively speaking. What ended up happening is I've actually got one of these rigged home presses that I use for pressing the hub into the bearing here. And in my case, if I could do it over again, I would not do use a homemade one. It does not work. It does not center perfectly here, especially, as you can see with the splines there in the hub. And what you could potentially do is the threads on an improperly sized bolt will end up damaging the splines. Mine did get nicked up a little bit, but not significantly enough to where it would actually affect the mating with the splines on the axle, the splines on the hub. I filed them down anyway, just to make sure. And so what I would do if I could do it over again is I would just purchase either the bearing already pressed into the hub, just as one assembly like this, the hub already pressed into the bearing. I would consider doing that. The extra expense is nominal. If you're doing like aftermarket parts, it's only another $60. Or you run down to the auto parts store, you purchase the proper bearing press kit, and I'll actually put a photo of it either in the description or in the comment section of exactly which kit I borrowed. I put up $400 just for a couple of hours and then pressed the hub into the bearing like an hour, not even that. And it was done perfectly, properly, headache-free. I would highly recommend that you do that. That's number one. Second thing, when I went to press, once I had the hub pressed into the bearing and I went to slide the hub onto the axle, the splines right there, get them to line up with each other. I was unable to do so. I got about maybe 1/3 of the way to halfway through, and it just seized. It stopped pushing in. And the tricky part here is that you have to hold the axle back here. You have to hold it with one hand while you push the hub, mate the splines together, and push the hub onto the axle here. And it was not so smooth for me. These are all original parts. I used the original hub. I didn't purchase another, a new hub. Didn't take the chance on the aftermarket splines not lining up perfectly. Although I've done it before on a Mercedes and it worked just fine. But that Mercedes had less miles. It was a little newer, relatively speaking. Anyhow, on this particular job, what I had to do in order to press by force the hub and the bearing onto the axle, I actually took the 36 millimeter socket that you use to undo the center nut here, and this is the old center nut. I took the old center nut and I put it in there, and then I took this old rusty 1/2-inch extension and attached it here. Okay, now mind you, this axle was pushed all the way in, okay? It was not even anywhere close to poking out of the hole here to where I could catch a couple of threads. Here's the new axle nut, where I could catch a couple of threads, okay? And then just with the air wrench, twist this and pull the axle nut out like I did after I was able to properly seat everything. But to properly seat it, like I said, my hub only went on about 1/3 to halfway, and it stopped. I had to call a friend of mine, have him come over, and I just needed him. And here's what it looks like, okay? So when you start hammering on the end of this, and that's what you're gonna do, you're gonna go what's his name, Phil Collins sledgehammer, okay? And mind you, this is pressed all the way in, so this axle nut is going to line up with this hole right here without damaging anything, without damaging the splines. That's why you want to put the old axle nut in here. You line it up, man, and you just start hammering. Have somebody hold it in place and then hold the back of this hub. You hold the back of the hub from back here. You need 4 hands for this, in my opinion, to do it right. And I gave it about 300 good whacks. 300, you heard me right. 300 good whacks on the end of this sacrificial 1/2-inch extension until the tip of this axle, and by the way, I put some bearing grease on both the interior of the hub and the axle, and while it was on there, I sprayed some PB Blaster in through here too, and also on the back. Okay, so I did both, man. It's probably not advisable to do both, but hey, it ended up working, so I'm not complaining. I ended up, after those 300 whacks with this and the axle nut, once the tip of the axle was flush with the splines right there on the hub, but it had not poked out enough to where I could catch a couple of threads, what you're going to need to do at that point is you're going to need to remove this from the socket. You're going to have to take it out, and now you're going to use just the socket part to do the hammering. You're going to line it up just right. Make sure it doesn't move too much to where you damage the splines. You're going to line it up because if you keep that nut right here, it's going to press against that, and that's not going to poke out. You want this to poke out enough, again, to catch a couple of threads. And then, you know, with your air wrench, just turn it clockwise, and it'll just pull the hub right out like it did for me. All right? So what you want to do is, once the tip of the axle is flush with the tip of the hub, all right, it's all flush, you're going to need to remove the axle nut, and now you're just going to line it up like this, and you're going to hammer it some more. Okay, it's going to be about, I don't know, man, 300 to 400 times, come to think of it. 300 times just to get it to flush up, maybe another 100 to get it to come out at least 2 or 3 threads. And then you can, again, I recommend you use the old axle nut. Don't damage it, you know. While you're removing it, don't damage it to where it's not reusable. Go ahead and, you know, just get a couple of threads. And then you want to do this with a torque wrench or use a breaker bar, okay? Don't put your air wrench on there and start tightening it. You want to do this by hand. You don't want to strip anything out. So with a torque wrench or with a breaker bar, you start tightening this baby up. And then once, you know, it gets in there a little bit, you got it on about halfway or 3/4 of the way. Then I went ahead and I used the impact wrench and pulled it all the way. It's still not all the way out. So I'm going to put the new one on now, and then I'm just going to go ahead and pull it out. And by the way, while we're on the job here, let me also note that these bolts back here for the bearings are 100 Newton meters, the torque specs on those. And again, this is on an E70 BMW 2009 X5 xDrive. This is the rear bearing, not the front bearing, rear bearings. So 100 Newton meters, and this center nut is 420 Newton meters. The torque specs, okay? Also, you're going to have to take the rear brake shoes off, man. In my case, there's no way I was going to be able to do any of this with it just hanging on the side. No, man. You're going to have to put it on. You know, it's a little bit more work, but it's going to be well worth it. In my case, I was unable to do it without doing this, but I've put these shoes on before, not a problem. So, hey, those are my notes. I want to put, like I said, a photo of that wheel bearing kit that I rented from the auto parts store in the comment section or the description down below. Oh, one other thing. When I was pulling the bearing out, I used one of those I rented, again, from the auto parts store. I rented one of those claws that goes on here. Not the one that screws on, but one of those claws that worked really well. But when the center is pointy, and it ended up making, you could see a couple of divots here, does not affect the vehicle in any way whatsoever. However, just in case you want to avoid that, you might want to get some hardened steel, you know, a little flat washer or something, you know, equivalent to, I don't know, dime size or something, and put it here, and then just to prevent the dimple from going into the axle, and then just put your, so then you could take that long bolt that goes through the claw and line it up with your little plate here that you're going to use as a buffer between the axle and the like I said, the long screw that goes through the claw, so you won't even have these two dimples on your axle. So those were my notes for doing this job. The rest of it, I even noted how many extensions you need and what configuration or whatever to take these bolts off. And I'll go ahead and put a link to that video in the description down below as well. Just some notes that I think will help you out, that ended up helping me out. I wish I would have known this ahead of time. Would have saved me a little bit of work. But hey, I do this all the time, so it wasn't that big a deal. Hope it helped you. Like, share, subscribe. Ring the bell so you get the next one on time. Bob Asadi, Easy Credit Motors. Talk to you on the next one.